I know Bad Empanada did a video where he's talking about you. He mentioned me very briefly, discussing Nelson Mandela in service of their narrative that like Hamas is imperfect resistance, but we have to support them because they're a liberation movement. And they're like ANC, right? So they do this comparison, but Mandela wasn't exactly unclear about how he felt about terrorism. He was saying that if we do terrorism, it's going to make our goal of reunification difficult. If the country spirals into out and out civil war, then we are moving away from our goal. Bad Empanada was saying that he was only saying that because he was on trial and he was trying to avoid the death penalty. But if you look at his rhetoric throughout, you just straight up cannot find any quotes of him saying violence against civilians was acceptable.
Mandela wasn't saying that to avoid the death penalty. Mandela said that because that's what they were doing. They escalated towards killing police officers and security officials, and military. But they never targeted civilians as a matter of policy. That's the difference.
Hey, what's up, man?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I watched a video of yours. Can't recall which one it was.
Boner.
But you started talking about me in the video. You pulled up a tweet where I was talking about denims and like the hospital bombings and stuff.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you thought that I was having like a rude awakening. I just wanted to clarify, and then I got curious about your story. But I just wanted to clarify, I've been sort of like clashing with leftists to varying degrees for like 10 years. So I've been fully informed about that for quite some time. But
okay.
But I got curious about your story. Have you always been a more like, how do you self-ID for the record? Do you like stock them or progressive liberal or?
Yeah, probably social democrat. Yeah.
What has your evolution been like in terms of like grappling with the more sort of like fringe elements of the left? Like I became sort of more aware of how toxic they were, specifically in like the 2020 primaries was when things really started to like shift in my mind. Like there's actually some really bad actors in that space, but I think I was maybe a little bit more naive to it before. Did you always sort of feel like there were destructive elements on the left, or did you become more disillusioned over time?
I was always like a little bit aware of it, but like in the sense that, you know, like one example, just because I remember being old, was like, you know, the Kathy Newman interview with Jordan Peterson, right? And the fact that she kept on him being like really evasive on his opinions about women. But all she would do is she would just keep being like, oh, so what you're saying is, so what you're saying is, so what you're saying is. And I always just felt like there was this kind of like desperation and like an attempt to kind of like pigeonhole someone without really trying to probe at like where they were wrong or like that kind of thing. And like the way that things were being handled was just like not very logical. But no, usually I was definitely much more far left in my 20s than I am now.
How old are you now?
Aware of 33.
Gotcha.
Even though I was aware of like lots of excesses, like I was never a Stalinist or any of that shit. But yeah, I used to definitely think the left were like a lot smarter than I do now. I used to think that they were a lot more reliable for factual stuff than I do now. Where it changed, I mean, I've always kind of been a bit skeptical of worse excesses anyway, but it definitely took a huge shift around when Russia invaded Ukraine. I think that was the really, really big, like, what the f is happening here? Yeah. Because I just noticed that so many people were pushing information that had nothing to do with what I would consider to be left-wing opinions. People were just pushing these things like really, really aggressively on like trying to blame NATO for all of Russia's aggression. It was like Hassan justifying the annexation of Crimea. Mm-hmm. Some people just not really giving a shit. And then also a lot of just information that I was getting from left-wing channels that I used to rely on, like Novara Media and things like that, were just saying things that turned out to be completely false. So I just got... And that just kind of like disillusioned me in a big way and just made me think, well, okay, if people I've trusted have been wrong on this, what else are they wrong about? And then I just started to like poke a lot more. And there's also just a thing about, you know, doing video essays and streaming, and just like that also involved just doing a lot more of my own reading in depth on things rather than going off of like the odd like Chomsky video or like pop academia stuff as well. So yeah, that just kind of started things rolling. I also within communities started to get really freaked out because most of my first videos, or a big number of my first videos, are all about like anti-racism and specifically anti-Islamophobia in the UK, right? So when I look at my channel like 2 years into it, and I find that my Discord is full of like Hamas supporters and shit like that, or like tankies, and I'm just like, how did that happen? You know, how did I attract that? So now I become a lot more mindful of even more sensible creators. Like I noticed when Sean just never made any videos about Ukraine.
Who's Sean? Sean the Black?
Sean Skull. No, Sean Skull.
I'm not familiar.
Yeah, the video essayist. I noticed that he had never made any videos about Ukraine, but even though he was happy to start doing it about Palestine, and I was the same with people like Noah Samson and things like that. And I'm like, what's going on here? Like, what's the, yeah. And then I just realized that this was not really something that I completely identified with. Yeah.
Are you talking about Sean Vids? That guy Sean Vids on Twitter?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think
it's just I'm also doing this full time, you know, because when you're not full time, you're not really reading as much. You're just watching YouTube videos, or you're reading like like pamphlets to learn about things rather than going in yourself. So the more I learned about each different topic, the more I was like, okay, what I've been fed before was a lot more simplistic and just downright false in some ways.
Yeah, I think we have really similar trajectories. I studied sociology as an undergrad. I ended up dropping out of college and never got a degree, but took a sociology course my freshman year and changed my major because I just became so interested in history. And then I got really hooked on Chomsky like a lot. Like I read all of his books. At the time there was Napster or whatever. And so I would like pirate all of his sort of lectures that he would give at universities and different Q&As that he would do. And there was a time where I regarded him as like infallible. There was nothing that he said. He was just so convincing to me that I never questioned anything he said. So when I was in my 20s, I was definitely more sympathetic to like socialism, though similarly to you, I never self-identified as like a Stalinist or anything, but I was definitely fiercely anti-capitalist. And it really, what started to kind of throw me for a loop was 2016. It was we had just got done with the primaries in the Democratic Party, which were very contentious. It was pretty explosive at the time. And then WikiLeaks started doing the dumps. And then it became this really kind of established orthodoxy in progressive spaces that the Democrats stole the nomination from Bernie. I'm sure you're aware of all that.
Yeah, I've heard that, yeah.
And I accepted that at face value in the beginning. I was like, fully, she stole it. I'm not going to vote for her. And then I took some time to look into it. And I was like, well, wait a second. Like, what were the actual vote tallies? Like, how much did the super delegates actually play into how the nomination was decided? And I discovered like, okay, he just lost by several million votes. There was no way to like rig these primaries. And I saw Donald Trump giving speeches in, July or whatever, basically parroting this talking point that the Democratic Party had stole the nomination from Bernie. And I remember thinking like, nobody that supports Bernie is going to believe this obvious bullshit. Like he's obviously trying to drive a wedge in the party to sort of like foment enough apathy that he can win in November. And I thought it was ludicrous that he would even try to do something like that. But then I saw a lot of Bernie people like repeating it over and over and over again. And a lot of them, like very visible progressive voices on social media, were announcing their intention to not vote for Hillary because she stole the nomination. So that was like my first kind of awakening about like, wait a second, there's some funny stuff going on in left-wing spaces. And then in 2020, it was like even more apparent to me. I'm not familiar. How familiar are you with like the Iowa caucuses in 2020?
Iowa? No, I don't know. Was this when they thought Bernie was in the lead, but then?
Yeah.
No, I don't know. You tell me. Never mind.
Yeah, Bernie was in the lead in the beginning before in a split field. Like he was dominating the split field. And one of the first contests was in Iowa. And Pete, I think, technically won that race. And people like Hassan and a lot of other leftists were theorizing that Pete had colluded with his ex-CIA friends to build an app that they used to tally the votes to like intentionally fudge the numbers, which is like fucking crazy. But after that, it really started to like, and then especially after like what you said, Ukraine and Israel Palestine is when I started to like really realize how toxic there are certain elements within the left wing spaces. When would you say you felt like, because I see them talk about you a lot.
Yeah.
When did you start to notice that they were honing in on you?
I don't know. I mean, ever since I had like I had a run-in with Bad and Panada like 3 years ago, and I was quite surprised back then by how much of a rift that caused like in my own community, because I was like, bro, this guy is literally advocating for like concentration camps. Like he's saying it out loud. Like what the fuck is going on here? And then, but as far as them actually going in on me properly, it was probably like in the last year, maybe. Yeah. But there's been phases, you know. I had a big fallout with the big fucking Demon Mama community and all those people because I said there wasn't a trans genocide happening in the United States. Although that was quite trivial compared to what's happening now. The Hassan Ukraine video, that caused a split in my own community. But as far as them going properly after me, yeah, it was probably around not long after October 7th. I think especially when Hassan watched some of my first video essays on Israel-Palestine, or yeah, because he watched a couple that I'd done a few months before the attack. And actually, there's not really that much in those videos I disagree with now, which is funny. But he liked them. He thought that they were good because one was me shitting on Netanyahu, right? And the other one was just me talking about Gaza, like a history video. I haven't really changed my mind on either of those videos, but Hassan liked it because I was shitting on Netanyahu, right? So it sounded like the pro-Palestine narrative. And I think the fact that he was like recommending me to his viewers and watching my videos on stream, the more extreme ones got really angry with that. And I guess that seemed to be when they were like more adamant to show how I'm like bad and shit. Yeah. Since then, it's just been a never ending adventure.
I'm curious about that. I want to circle back to that, but like, tell me if you've noticed the same thing, but like my observations about like, I feel like you can probably find a lot of reasonable progressive or pro-Palestinian voices on social media, but a lot of this discourse is driven by the most ideologically extreme people. And so it becomes super mainstream. But what I've observed is that it seems like for them, they don't want to acknowledge certain things for fear that it may be perceived as legitimizing Israel, like all of Israel's actions. So like the sexual violence on October 7th is like a really good example. Like in my mind, it should not be mutually exclusive to just unequivocally condemn that sort of just wanton like barbarism. And also at the same time say that Palestinians deserve the right of self-determination. They should have their own state. The blockade should ideally be ended. And like these things are not mutually exclusive, but they treat it like it is. Or, you know, if you get into the reason why the blockade happened, like it's not necessarily a defense of maintaining a blockade for 2 decades. But when you look at like why it happened in the first place, it kind of makes sense. Like I looked at the amount of suicide bombings that happened like by year. And I think it's in like, was it 2003 or 2004? When was the second Intifada? Was that 2004?
2000, 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah.
Well, sometime there was one particular year that it went from the previous year, there were like 2 suicide bombings in Israel proper, or greater Israel. And then the next year it was like fucking dozens.
Yeah, that's like 2001-ish, yeah.
Right. And then that number went back to like almost like none, or many of the years it was no suicide bombings after the blockade. So you can argue that Israel had a legitimate basis for security concerns at that time, and that imposing the blockade was a rational decision. And at the same time, you can argue that Netanyahu himself was an avowed obstacle to a 2-state solution. And he was, you know, arguably more of a hindrance to the peace process than Hamas. But these people, I feel like they can't keep those 2 thoughts in their heads at the same time. It has to be like this oppressor-oppressed dynamic. And to a certain degree, they're right? Like there's the asymmetry is obviously on full display, but the nuance, their capacity for nuance just seems to have been like utterly annihilated since the start of this conflict.
Yeah, although it's like, to me, I don't really see it that much as like, I think most people are more internally consistent than we think they are, because when it comes to Israel Palestine, like it's not really like an illogical thing I see from them. I mean, it obviously does appear that way, but I think it's because for a lot of people, it's like, it's not really a battle of like prescriptive positions or did this factual thing happen or not. Like to them, it's a battle of narratives. You know, it's like pro-Palestine or pro-Israel. The way that these people use it means all, right? Because like really, if you're sensible, you should be pro both. Even if you want one state, you should probably want Israelis and Palestinians both to have a level of like sovereignty or autonomy, because they want different societies, even if they share the same country, right? Like even in a federalized system or something like that. So to me, it's a battle of narratives, but that also happens within the conflict as well, right? Because the conflict itself is like, there are entrenched narratives on either side that no one really wants to cede, because they feel like if they cede anything, then they're undermining their own side and their own cause. The problem is that there's nothing about Israel-Palestine that falls neatly into standard like binaries. Like it doesn't fall neatly into east or west. Yeah. It doesn't fall neatly into like brown versus white. It doesn't fall neatly into oppressor versus oppressed even. I can go into that if you want. Yeah, it doesn't fall into any of these. But people really want to squeeze it into one of those. And that's where you just end up like, you have to just adopt a narrative that doesn't make any sense in relation to the reality. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like one of the most I think common narratives is that Hamas, we can describe them as imperfect resistance, but they are legitimate resistance, like liberation movement, and therefore like it would be, what's the word I'm looking for? Very like biased towards the West to condemn them for like acts of terrorism, for example. Which is it's another one of those things that I feel like, and so once you establish that narrative, you need to like legitimize that narrative through historical references. And so I know you're familiar with this, but they bring up like Nelson Mandela a lot, and they bring up like the ANC in South Africa, and this to me is a very problematic comparison, and I would love to get into it with you more, because I'm sure you're just much more capable of kind of diving into the minutia there. But like the ANC, for example, like they were basically Marxists. They weren't like avowed Marxists, but they had aligned themselves with Marxist organizations all over the world for decades, including the PLO. Hamas are a group of religious extremists who declare as their goal the complete usurpation of the entire, from the river to the sea, through Islamic law, and then rule over that with Islamic law. I mean, they talked about, I know Bad Empanada did a video where he's talking about you. He mentioned me very briefly, discussing Nelson Mandela. And it seems like these, in service of their narrative, that like Hamas is imperfect resistance, but we have to support them because they're a liberation movement, and they're like ANC, right? So they do this comparison, but Mandela wasn't exactly unclear about how he felt about terrorism. You can't find a single quote from him endorsing like full-on terrorism. And it's true that you had certain people within ANC who were granted amnesty during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And some people, there was one guy in particular, I think his name was McBride. He did this bombing. He had targeted a bar because he thought that it was a hotspot for like off-duty. What were the security? Yeah. Right. Yeah.
He thought it was like a air like pilots or something. Yeah.
And he ended up killing
security officials. Yeah.
He ended up killing like 20 civilians. Like I don't even think a single military target was killed during that strike. He was put on trial for that and found guilty and sentenced to death, but was granted amnesty through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because at the time they were just saying like anybody who did political violence up to a certain standard or whatever could come forward, just account for what they did, and they were basically granted for forgiveness at the time.
But it's not even that. It's like within the conflict as well, during the when apartheid was still standing in the mid 80s, but 10 years before it collapsed, when those deaths were happening and when those attacks were taking place, there was like the Church Street bombing as well, which was just like horrible intel, where they thought that there was like, I think it was the Air Force they were going after, but yeah, they killed civilians. Or like the land mining, which they had intended to use against like personnel carriers and tanks. I think they had to call that off after 2 years because like 22 people died and 21 of them were civilians, right? So, but the difference is that when those civilians were dying, within the conflict still ongoing, the ANC said, we don't want to kill civilians. We're trying to avoid civilian casualties. And then a few people lost their positions. They were demoted. There was like a rearrangement. They literally dispatched all the commanders to all the different units, and all in exile. They did this, by the way, to remind people of what their ethics were and like what was a legitimate target and what wasn't. Because unfortunately, disciplining people when you're a leadership in exile is very difficult. But they tried anyway, and they did this when, like, 1 year, I think 70 people died, mostly civilian, and that's too much. We need to like rein this in, and they did. It's like, it's ironic that Baden Panada would try to like claim that as something that would support his position, because if you pushed him, he hates the ANC, really. He thinks he would be the kind of person that said like they compromised too much by allowing the whites to stay. He wants an Algerian solution, not a South African one. So that's but
he also ran cover for Mandela, like on a couple different points that I thought were very dubious points that he made. So the first one he made was, you know, obviously, like, you and me will cite the speech that he gave during his trial, where he very, very explicitly, very clearly lays out his logic, his reasoning for why they didn't want to do terrorism. So there were 4 different types of violence, right? There was like sabotage, terrorism, and then like revolution, like war, right? And his thinking was, if we did, he wasn't even, in my mind, when I read that letter and I read the whole transcript, he wasn't even necessarily making a moral argument against terrorism. He was coming at it more from a practical perspective. He was saying that if we do terrorism, it's going to make our goal of reunification difficult. If the country spirals into out and out civil war, then we are moving away from our goal. So he was just attacking it from a very like practical perspective. But Baden Panada was saying that he was only saying that because he was on trial and he was trying to avoid the death penalty. But if you look at his rhetoric throughout, like, you know, you can find quotes from his, obviously he became like way more anti-violence towards the end of his life after they had sort of like already accomplished that goal. But you just straight up cannot find any quotes of him saying that violence against civilians was acceptable. And when you point that out online, or when I pointed that out online, I had so many people coming in my mentions posting quotes of Mandela saying that violence could at some point become necessary, and in fact had become necessary in their struggle against apartheid. But they're just completely,
there's violence and there's being Gandhi. That's the only binary. Right. It's stupid. It doesn't make any fucking sense. Mandela wasn't saying that to avoid the death penalty. Mandela said that because that's what they were doing. Things did escalate after the 60s. So in the 70s and 80s, the ANC would occasionally target military and police personnel. They did do that, although most of that was outside of South Africa, like in Rhodesia. It was still, I think the South African police at the end of the conflict logged like 1,500 ANC operations, right? And 250 people died. So even at the peak of it, they were still mostly targeting infrastructure, mostly. So yeah, the fact that they escalated towards killing police officers and security officials, like and military, but they never targeted civilians as a matter of policy. That's the difference. Just because some fires did, and when they did, that was dealt with. They didn't have much of an infrastructure to jail them or anything, but they literally did like a whole reining in, and this was public. I can show you an article from the New York Times in 1987 when the ANC are like publicly announcing that they're doing this and that they don't want civilians to get hit. So you can, and then they did. The deaths went down like immediately after. So it's they weren't just saying it for PR.
Mandela is kind of an interesting person to, I say interesting, I'll say questionable person to invoke if you're like strictly anti-Zionist. Because Mandela himself never identified as a Zionist, but he absolutely whether that be because of just practical considerations or sort of just like a support for the state of Israel broadly or whatever. But he came out and said, I mean, you can find a quote. I found a quote from him in 1999. Israel had occupied some land in Lebanon, I think. And there was a question about like whether or not Israel would cede that territory and withdraw. And you can find a quote from it in 1990. Again, this is like well into the conflict at this point. And he basically says that it's reasonable that Israel would hang on to that land until they got assurances from the neighboring Arab countries that they wouldn't try to attack or invade. He stressed, I mean, he was a stalwart supporter of the PLO and the general like cause of Palestinian liberation, but he at no point said that he was open to a one-state solution, as far as I'm aware. And at no point did he say that Israel didn't have a right to, in his own words, be secure within their own borders.
He also went further. I think in '93, one of his speeches was about literally supporting Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, like the legitimacy of Zionism and Israel as a Jewish state. He even affirmed that. So, yeah.
Well, a lot of like civil rights leaders in the United States, for example, they sympathize with the Jewish plight. Like Rosa
as well, right? Yeah.
Rosa Parks, MLK, yeah, they identified with like Jewish persecution and they backed Israel. Like, pretty sure both Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King were like, they were definitely self-avowed Zionists.
Yep.
But anyways, like the other, well, anyway, I wanted to circle back to like, so when you find yourself on the receiving end of this sort of like mob, this angry mob, what do you do? Do you not look at Twitter for a little bit? Do you sort of swim in it? How do you decide when you're going to engage?
I just antagonize them more. I don't know. Depends. Depends on what mood I'm in. It's pretty random. I don't. Yeah. It's for me. It's not that hard for me to opt out of it because, like, there are other things in life that I like doing as well as fighting with crazy people. So, and I'm kind of in a position now where, like, I don't know, like sometimes I will just like deliberately throw out like edgy claims, like just because I kind of want to excise this kind of people from my community. And I've been very like over the last 1 or 2 years, I've just been very, very relentless in making sure that kind of like, there are typical like behavior patterns that I notice, and they happen on right wingers as well, but like that I just look out for and just purge like as quickly as possible, because I don't want these people. I don't like them in my community. I don't want them like trying to sway me. I just don't want to be involved with them really, apart from as like antagonists. So yeah, I'm okay with that. But yeah, it's just like depends on whether I'm up for getting into the stress or not, rolling in the mud. The thing with Mandela, I was going to say as well, is like, you ever heard of a concept called idol grabbing?
No.
There's this thing where ideologues will fight over popular figures from history and just kind of summarize all of their worldviews down to this little post-it note to use them to validate the things that they support now. So like
the letter from the Birmingham jail for MLK or whatever.
Yeah. Everyone. Yeah. So right wingers do it and left wingers do it with MLK, right? Even though MLK was probably like dem sock dem.
That's
like,
right.
He wasn't any further than that. Yeah. They do it with Mandela, which it's very easy to do with Mandela because Mandela was an incredible statesman. He was friends with everyone, right? So he would say all these things about Zionism and Israel, very supportive, but at the same time, he would also be very friendly with people who wanted to destroy Israel, right? He would actually spend quite a lot of time hanging out with not just PLO people, because they were kind of different back then, but this was like, he would even go along with like PFLP types or friendly relations with the FLN. But he was also very friendly with the Queen, like on first name terms with the Queen. Not many people were. So yeah, that's why people will just try to take whatever like minutia from people like that and seize it for themselves. Yeah, which is again like the fact is that if Mandela were actually saying the things back then that he says now, yeah, he would be seen as like a fucking shitlib. Yeah, he would be. Right. Yeah. People, it's easier to claim someone in death than it is when they're still talking. You know.
Yeah, if Twitter was the thing,
words in their mouths. Yeah.
If Twitter was a thing when Mandela was alive or MLK, this group of people that we're speaking about now, this like kind of toxic element on the left, they would savage both of these characters. Like MLK Jr. is a really good example of, what did you call it? Idol grabbing?
Yes. Yeah.
So like obviously, yeah, right wingers will cite his, I have a dream speech where people are judged by the content of the character, not the color of their skin or whatever. They'll cite that as saying, see, even MLK was against identity politics. Meanwhile, he was like fully advocating for reparations and, these sorts of things. And then lefties will point for sure that the number one thing that they point to for MLK is the letter from the Birmingham jail, when he mentions, white moderates and sort of the kind of obstacle that they posed to the civil rights struggle. But if you actually read the letter, and it's not that long, the letter from the Birmingham jail is like 5 pages, it takes like 15 minutes to read. He was very specifically, he was kind of speaking in generalities, but he was referencing there was a group of like white pastors that were in the southern states that were complaining that he was doing too much agitating. And so he was specifically responding to them, even though he was speaking in generalities. And in the same letter, I don't know if you know this, in the same letter, in a separate area, he talks about how they had a planned protest in one of the states, like Alabama, I'll just make it up, and a runoff election was scheduled at the same time as their planned protest. And he talked about...
They delayed it so they didn't want to disrupt the election, right?
Right. MLK Jr. in the letter from the Birmingham jail was stressing the importance in engaging directly in electoral politics, voting, taking elections seriously. And I find it quite amusing and ironic that the same people that are making the case that, we need to break away from the Democratic Party and we shouldn't vote for Kamala, blah, blah, blah. These are the same people that cite MLK Jr. But MLK Jr. was like, he was smart enough to understand that you have to claw away at power inch by inch. Like you can't just like cede all this ground to conservatives in government, because it would make your job harder. Just feel like that one always sticks out to me. Like it's funny you mentioned that, but because you're absolutely right. It's like both the left and the right just completely bastardize MLK Jr. for their own like cynical purposes.
It's everything about it, like because I think with both him and Mandela, the more I read about them, it's like they're both so much more like intelligent and mindful than any of the people who invoke them give them credit for, right? Because when you're looking through Birmingham jail, and like even I thought like MLK was just like some brave dude who was good at like a pastor, like a goofy Christian talking about peace and dreams and equality and all that, and then like it was just like he was like a good speech like figurehead, right? And that's all I thought.
Oh, he was a calculated guy.
Jail and all that. Yeah, it's super calculated, and it's very, very. You can tell he's like thought everything from like down to the basic morality to the means to the ends. Like it's all very, very well thought out, so that to the point where even in Birmingham jail, where he's talking about how they would have these self-purification sessions, where they would talk about showing people like how to, if you're going to go to a protest, you have to make sure that you can, like, if you're going to stand on the outside, you have to know that you might have to take blows from the cops and not retaliate, because if you retaliate, it's going to look like a fight, not like oppression. And if you and making sure to have like the well-trained people on the outside, or the veterans on the outside, because they can absorb blows, or making sure to search people for weapons, and knowing to go to the right states where you know that the police are actually going to ruffle you up. Because I think when they went to Albany in Georgia, the cops there they were rabid segregationists, but the police chief was clever enough not to antagonize the protesters too much, because they didn't want to make a spectacle of it. So basically you just had protests, like protesters marching, but the cops just kind of like gently arresting some of them, guiding the protests into quieter areas, and then nothing came from it. But when they went to Birmingham, it was Birmingham where it was Bull Connor. Was that where he was? The Dixiecrat, the cop?
I'm not sure.
I think it was. Where that guy was like, he was a nutcase. He was really violent. And that's where they got all the media attention. So, yeah, I don't know. But yeah, people just don't really give these guys any credit. They just use them to justify whatever nonsense they were going to support anyway.
Yeah, they were the point of the nonviolence was not to be like perfectly in keeping with Christ's teachings, for example. I mean, they were very calculated about like why they wanted to practice nonviolence, and they were right. Like when Americans saw images and video of black people being brutalized on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that was a big inflection point for the civil rights movement. These people that was the sacrifice they were making. They were willing to risk not only their personal freedom, but their personal security, like their well-being, their physical well-being, for the cause. And if you apply that to like a modern lens, there's like two really good contrasting events that happened recently, semi-recently. The first one was in 2020 when all the BLM protests were happening all over the country. I'm not talking about the riots, but the actual protests. I don't know if people in your chat or my chat recall, or if you recall, but there was one thread that somebody posted. It was like a master thread of over 100 videos that people had shot during those protests of cops that were clearly brutalizing like nonviolent protesters. And that became very, very salient. That got people really upset. Nobody likes to see somebody who is, basically not posing any kind of a threat be subject to like physical brutality. And so that was a really effective kind of piece of propaganda. I mean, propaganda in like the neutral sense. It was an effective way to garner support for BLM. Now, if you contrast that with like the UCLA protests recently, last year for the Israel stuff, they got nothing but bad press because you had this group of hundreds of students that built a physical encampment. They were basically provoking the police to come in and be violent with them. And then they engaged violently with the police. So the police, when they went into the encampment, the first thing that some of the students did was shoot a fire extinguisher at the cops. And I feel like a lot of those protests where the student protesters were basically picking fights with cops, it did nothing but hurt their cause. Just made people more. Yeah, I mean, I just feel like in so many ways these people are the worst advocates for these kinds of things.
I don't know about that. I think they're very appropriately representing the movements that they support, because that's what the Axis of Resistance does, right? That's what Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis do. They launch useless attacks and then cry when the retaliation happens. That's about what. That's fair. Right. Like the guys running with bins turned into shields, running at the cops and falling over when the cops.
Did you see the remix of that where somebody added like the Avengers theme with the kazoo?
Yeah, because that's probably what was in his head, right? Like he was probably thinking about the Riders of Rohan before he like came face to face with that guy. That is I don't know if this is maybe something that's always happened. Like maybe there were loads of dumb protesters in the 60s that history just doesn't remember because they were the ones that didn't achieve anything. Like, I mean, I guess Malcolm X, right? Because he was kind of like useless back in his day. He didn't really actually do all that much.
There were examples of counterproductive protests back in the day. I mean, like the protest at the 68 Democratic National Convention, I think, violence broke out and ended up like turning people away from their cause. And so, the point of protest is not to do it in a way that's not disruptive. I mean, it's fine to be disruptive. That's like the point of civil disobedience. But if you're out there provoking physical altercations with cops, I don't understand the value of that to your cause. It doesn't help anything. And what drove me insane was, especially during those student protests last summer or last year, whenever it was there were like prominent left-wing creators with really big platforms on social media that were like lionizing a lot of the kids that were physically engaging with the police. And I got so pissed when I saw that, because it's like, bro, you're not there, you're not the one that's risking felony assault of a police officer, and these kids are all staring at their phones when they're at these events. They're not just, they're obviously plugged into what social media is saying. So if you're incentivizing like a kid, like if you're going to try to get a kid all jacked up on adrenaline, so he's going to go like assault a cop, it feels like you're offloading all of the risk onto them, while you're sitting in the comfort of your home. There's nothing stopping you from like joining them at this protest and physically getting in a physical altercation with cops. That just drove me insane. But what do you think about like, so I assume you would agree that like on social media, the people on the fringes, the people on the extremes generate more discourse than people with like complex or nuanced takes on things. And I'm wondering first of all, do you agree with that?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
What do you think, like, like, what do you think? I don't know what label you want to apply, but like, what do you think like rational people on the left need to do to build spaces that compete with like the Hassans and the other voices? Because right now, I just feel like they have a crazy outsized influence on the discourse, and I would argue in like really negative ways. And it's just incredibly difficult to, like, for example, if you're going to have a conversation about the rules of war with respect to how to target a hospital, it's like a really short, concise thing to say, you know, like bombing hospitals is wrong, which, you know, 99 times out of 100, that's true, right? Like a general rule of thumb. And this is what international law says. There's narrow exceptions, but it is a war crime to bomb a hospital that doesn't have any protections. It's really easy to say that and just leave it there. But if you interject with, well, I mean, permanent like immunity from being bombed just doesn't really make sense if you think about it. It just like, I experienced so much crazy vitriol in my mentions because a bunch of like prominent left wingers started like talking about me saying that. And
yeah, but that's because they don't, well, first of all, okay, so I think for half the people it's probably just because it's like, it's a position that feels bad to say, because like targeting a hospital with military anything, like it doesn't matter if there are soldiers or like threats in that building. It's like, it still feels bad to say. People just want to go with the thing that feels good. And that's probably just where it begins and ends. With other people, there's no point explaining any of this to them, right? Like these are the same people who still think the pager attack was as an indiscriminate terrorist operation that was just all about murdering civilians, even though Hezbollah and the IRGC admitted themselves that those pagers were for their own operatives. Like, and that's most of the, like the vast majority of people who died were Hezbollah. The vast majority of people who got injured were Hezbollah by those pagers because they were for Hezbollah. They were targeting Hezbollah. And just because like, yeah, sorry, if you have a group that hides among civilians, sometimes you're going to kill civilians as well along with them. But as far as like the level of precision, you're never going to get better than that pager attack. But people condemn that anyway. It's not because they think it wasn't perfect enough, right? It's not because of the two kids who very tragically got killed as well. Yeah. It's not, they're not upset because of that though. They would still be upset if those two kids didn't die. They're upset because they want those guys to win. So as far as like the Middle East goes though, if you're like a center left activist in the US, like what are you trying to achieve by talking to tankies about hospitals? Probably, like, I don't know, the idea would be there. I mean, not much Westerners can do in the Middle East anyway, even especially with Trump in. What the f these protesters think they're going to achieve now with Trump in office? You think you're going to scream at Trump and he's going to start talking about ceasefires and aid and arms embargoes? Like, no.
Right. Well, their position is that the Democratic Party is maximally evil and therefore indistinguishable from the Republican Party. Like, I don't know why I agreed to this because this guy is like immediately just wildly bad faith, but I agreed to talk to a leftist this coming Tuesday about the situation. And yeah, there was just a lot of discourse about like the bombing of the hospitals that was in my mentions for like several days.
Yeah.
You mentioned sort of like the things that these people cling to, the things that these people believe in that are contradicted by like Hezbollah's own words or actions or Hamas's own words or actions. So like a really good example of this is like if there's some kind of Israeli strike on, you know, an apartment building, a university, a hospital, and they put forth evidence or claim that there was some kind of tunnel system underneath, like they like to mock that. They like to say like, oh, there's a tunnel everywhere, isn't there? Every single bomb, there's a tunnel. And then you can find,
yeah, but Hamas agrees with that.
Right? Yeah, you can find Hamas leadership
speeches.
No, yes, they are bragging. I just watched a speech last night of somebody who I think is dead now, but a Hamas leadership person who was saying that they have 300 miles of tunnels under Gaza. Like they do not deny that they have like hundreds of miles of tunnels underneath Gaza, and yet the very notion of this being a thing, like these leftists mock that. Anyways, it's just, yeah, this stuff is
you will find that's very common in a lot of this discourse. Is you will literally see Israel says a thing, Hamas says a thing, leftist disagrees. That's like, that will happen very often. It's the same with the pagers. Nasrallah came out on day 2 and said, oh yeah, this has caused a huge blow to Hezbollah, not to Lebanon, to Hezbollah. This is massively does. He said it openly. Okay, so it's funny how they're like, but then I'm still looking on social media and people are like, these pagers were spread among the civilian population. Like these could have been any civilian. I don't even think to this day there's a report of someone, like even a bystander who wasn't holding a pager who got injured by that. So it's like, yeah, the pagers hit the people who were holding the pagers. And in one or two cases, that was like the civilian family members of the Hezbollah operatives who were asking for them to get the pager for them, like the two kids who died. But with everything else, it was like, yeah, they're all admitting this. But meanwhile, and Israel's saying this, but somehow like, it's like, I consent, but what about me? All 5,000 miles away saying that I think this targeted civilians. But no, at the end of the day, it seems like both the people on the ground agree on this, but you don't. Same with the tunnels. Yeah, Hamas will tell you that they have 500 kilometers of tunnels. The IDF says they have 500 kilometers of tunnels. That's just like, why do I need to have a white person in America, in LA, to tell me otherwise?
It was really incredible timing, because like 2 days after all these lefties felt like they did like a coordinated attack on me, because I said, it was just like something random I said during a stream reaction. And this little thing got clipped, and then all of a sudden, like multiple people posting about it, and I've got all these deranged replies. Me talking about like the narrow exceptions to bombing a hospital, and then 2 days later, Israel kills Hamas's military leadership person. Sinwar, was it Sinwar's like half brother or his brother?
So I'm not. Yeah, it's Mohammed Sinwar. I don't know if he's confirmed dead. Though,
right.
But,
yeah.
It seemed to be that the main targets were him and two other people, but I have no idea.
And who did?
No idea what actually?
And they had to.
Yeah.
And they had to do a strike right next to a hospital. Like, if what they said was true, he was hiding underneath the hospital. So, I mean, like, I guess to balance things out, lately I find myself more sympathetic to using the word genocide because of the blockade, because of the humanitarian aid blockade. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about that?
I think if they don't, so based on what they're saying about, again, you can even hear this from within the IDF now. Like even the chief of staff has said we only have a matter of weeks before it's like an irreversible path to humanitarian crisis, like full on. So I think if they don't let aid in before the end of this month, I'm not going to care if anyone calls it genocide. I wouldn't split hairs on that, regardless of what they're intending to get out of it.
It's pretty. I mean, and I think this is a really good example to point to of like why the election mattered, and the people that didn't. That refused to make a distinction between Kamala and Trump because of Biden's policy, I thought were just completely foolish. I mean, there have been a number of things that have already established it so far. That should have gone right out the window the day that Trump said we're going to annex Gaza and permanently ethnically cleanse. At that point, I feel like every single one of them should have said like, okay, I got that wrong because this is way worse. I'm going to be honest, Loner, I lost my train of thought there. What were we talking about again? No. So it was 80%. I think I read the figure that 80% of Gaza relies on that humanitarian aid. The Biden administration, when that war first kicked off, they sent emissaries or whatever. They sent like Jake Sullivan and Blinken and the Secretary of Defense to have discussions with the Israeli military. And one of the first questions that the Biden administration asked Israel in the early stages of that war, we're talking about like October 8th, October 9th, you know, as they're like ramping up their military and getting ready for a full-on assault of Gaza. One of the first things that the Biden administration asked them is, what are your plans for humanitarian aid? And Israel's response at the time was, what are you talking about? We're not giving them aid. Why would we give our enemies aid? And the Biden administration had to tell them, they said there's no way that you're going to be able to do this. You're going to lose the support of every country in the world if you don't do this. It's morally wrong. Like, you have to do this. And so they successfully pressured Israel to allow aid into the region. And that lasted throughout the entire, through the rest of Biden's term. There were individual instances and there were moments, I think, where aid was blocked. And you could like people were arguing that not enough aid was getting in. And so I'm not speaking to all that, but it was because of the Biden administration that aid was allowed into that region. And now we have a case where the Trump administration, they're not putting any pressure on them to allow aid into the country. So it was so.
Remember in October 2024 when I can't remember who it was. I think it was someone in Southern Command, particularly, was like unilaterally blocking aid from the north of Gaza, from the evacuated part of the north. And then Kamala said, we're going to reconsider our arms deals with Israel if you don't change this. And then on day 2, after her saying that, Kogat starts filming themselves sending trucks into the north. It was like the difference between that and Trump is like, I mean, I know that if you're white, like Ogre Boy with a Hassan tattoo and none of this actually affects you, the difference between going 70 days without aid versus 2 weeks is actually not that much from where you're saying. But from down there, it's like really important. Yeah. And Kamala actually did do that because there was a point in October 2024, you can look this up, when aid was withheld from the north for 2 weeks. Kamala spoke up. America threatened to reconsider their arms deals with Israel unless this changed, and it changed the day after they warned them. So that's the difference between Harris and Trump. But
or Rafa, Rafa was a really good example of this. I mean, like this. I can't remember what month this was in. Was it like September or August or something like that? But they had pushed Hamas. Basically, they had pushed like everybody in Gaza into this city in southern Gaza, and Israel had announced their plans to go in, and that I think what they were saying at the time was like they had eliminated all but 3 Hamas cells, and the remaining 3 were in Rafah, and so they were going to send the tanks in. They were going to do a full-on assault. The problem is that there was like 1.5 million like civilians like in that region, and it was the Biden administration who pressured them to allow for evacuations first. And they got resistance at first. Israel said, no, we're not going to give them an opportunity to like evacuate Hamas and embed them with the civilians and get them out of there. And the Biden administration, again, successfully pressured them. It's like, no, this just, you cannot do this. Like the death toll for the civilian death toll for this would not be
they had to fight for it. Yeah.
Proportional. And what happened? They evacuated, I think close to 1 million people in 3 weeks. Yep. And saved, I mean, how many thousands of lives were saved because of that pressure campaign? And now
it's like you're not talking to rational people, right? You're talking to people who think it's all or nothing. So, yeah.
So, I mean, like, what do you, like, do you have any thoughts about like, is it possible for more sort of like rationally minded people or nuanced people to compete with the extremists in these spaces? Or do we just have to forever be sort of at a disadvantage here?
I don't know if I'm the right person to ask for that particularly, because at the end of the day, despite the fact that these guys have so much power on social media, that's really the only place they have power. And so it seems to be the only place that they want to have power, because what else do they do? What else are they? It's almost to my benefit that these guys have no idea what they're talking about, and they're willing to just sacrifice every optical opportunity they have to the broader public, because they don't behave like people who want to achieve anything outside of their social media spaces and like clout. So just kind of let them do it and do your own thing. Again, you can still do your canvassing. You can still do like local actions that you support. I mean, I still support local actions like when they're happening. I just don't really talk that much about it. Or if I've got like friends who are engaged in things, I'll still like help out every now and then. So as far as the space goes, yeah, I don't know, like the fact that like just the other day I was talking about Israel's new plan for Gaza with like the aid arrangements and everything, and contrasting it with the fact that most Israelis now would happily stop the war in exchange for the rest of the hostages and just cut it there. And
Palestinians.
People in Israeli defense think that as well, by the way. People in Israeli intel think that, and the kind of like independent intel community that's not in the IDF, but they are very much side by side with them. They're saying that too. The Americans have been saying that since like last summer. So I don't know. I felt like just if I was going to do anything here, it was like there are quite a few Israelis in my chat, so I'll just get them to go out and protest and tell them when they are happening. And it's like, I feel like that already is like more than I'd be satisfied with, or like it's been more impactful than anything that like running at people with shields in a uni, other than that, it's just like, probably if I wanted to just achieve things like politically and that was like the number one thing and nothing else really mattered, then I'd probably just pretend these guys don't exist. But,
Yeah, I feel like their brand is like radical, like ceaseless pessimism. So like they don't even make an attempt to pretend to care about political power when you interrogate their beliefs a little bit. Like the one thing you hear a lot from lefties is, they were basically, a lot of them, I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of them were like euphoric when Kamala lost. There's that famous tweet where it was like, Gaza's speaking now, bitch. Like that kind of like sentiment was like very widespread, I think. And so I noticed that, especially in the first like few months after she lost, there were a lot of people a lot of lefties in my in my mentions in my chat or whatever that were basically gloating that the Democrats did so poorly. But if you ask them, like, well, hey, I mean, yeah, we lost an election by a couple points, but like, how are you guys doing? They don't even pretend to. They don't even pretend to care about like not having any political power. And there's always this sort of excuse, like, so they're not too different from MAGA. Like, if I ask you, like, hey, you know, like you want to say that Kamala lost because she was campaigning with Liz Cheney and secretly the country is just super socialist. And if she would have just run as a socialist, she would have like won all 50 states. Like, if that were true, how do you explain the fact that the progressives did way worse than moderates during this election? And they always have this thing where it's like, oh, it was rigged against us. It was AIPAC or it was the outside lobbyists. And, you know, they don't even pretend to have aspirations of actually achieving power within the government, within the Congress and the presidency. And it just doesn't seem to matter to them whatsoever. And so at that point, I feel like if you're engaging in politics and you don't have optimism at the core of your beliefs, then I don't understand what the point, like the point of, I think, engaging in politics is recognizing that things could be better and that we can achieve better things. But if you don't believe that we can achieve better things, if you think that the system is so corrupt and broken that it's just going to get worse and worse and worse, at that point, why don't just spend all your time like having sex and doing drugs and just like fully committing to hedonism? Because what's the point? But they seem to want to like spread that pessimism everywhere they go. Like they want other people to feel as miserable as they do, is what I've observed. Okay.
I don't know. I know what it was like to be in my 20s. I know what it was like to be kind of like bored, lost, confused, like as a youth. I've had those phases, but it's like, yeah, I feel like that's always going to exist. It just happens to be now that they've found a space where they can actually exert like a strange amount of influence. At least if it's MAGA, you know, those people, they actually have the same thing. They're lost and confused and everything, but they actually pursue political action and they do things and they achieve things. So that's like, but it's better that, it would be better if they didn't, you know? I kind of wish MAGA were the same kind of like level of just abstract idealist and they were just kind of more obsessed with moralizing and harassing people on Twitter than what they're doing now, which is like threatening the democracy of like 300 million people.
So you don't see a lot of value in like directly engaging with these people, like doing debates and that kind of thing?
There's value for me in the sense that it's enjoyable. Like it's entertaining for the audience. I think it maybe does affect a few minds because it's not uncommon. I'll get people like saying, oh, former Hassan viewer, used to believe this shit, used to believe that. Now I reconsidered. People coming to me in the streets saying the same thing. Yeah, I've had all that stuff. That's cool. But if I wanted to like build a movement or something like that, then yeah, I'd probably want to get as far away from these people as possible because they would just like follow me around and like try to sabotage. And yeah, that would be not very nice. So yeah, it's like, I don't really think that much about why I choose the things that I do. But as long as I can feel like there's something good coming out of it beyond just like my own interests, then I'm okay with it. And the fact that I do have people who have had their minds changed by it is like enough for me.
Well, cool, man. Appreciate you talking to me. I like you, man. You're definitely, whenever people ask me for suggestions of who to watch, I always suggest you first. And I've learned a lot from a few of your videos. So I think you're doing a really good job, man.
I appreciate it. Shit.
One more question for you though.
Yeah.
Do you have ADHD? Have you ever taken stimulants for ADHD?
Hell yeah. I'm on Vyvanse right now.
Bro, so I just started yesterday. What was it like for you in the beginning? Like, how did you adjust to it? What differences did you notice? Because I'm jacked to the tits right now.
Yeah, it feels like you're on uppers. What's your dosage?
Pretty low, but I never dabbled with uppers. I was always like weed, alcohol. So I'm on like 20 milligrams.
Okay.
But for sure, like, definitely feel it for sure.
Are you on extended release or?
I think, isn't Vyvanse inherently extended release? I think is what I was reading.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I think the way that they designed the drug was that it's not the drug itself that's like doing a direct thing to your body. It's like what your body does with the drug that releases it. And because that process is slower, it's sort of like by its very nature extended release. But yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that about Vyvanse. I guess because I went between like Ritalin and Vyvanse, and that meant going between like instant release and extended release. So I didn't actually know that Vyvanse was just extended. But I'm on 30 right now and have been for quite a while. I went up to 40 once. It put my heart rate too high, but yeah, the first kind of like hour of it hitting you, like you will feel like you've just taken uppers. Like you feel slightly euphoric, maybe. Like it feels quite nice, like cozy.
A little bit, yeah. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
So don't get sad when that bit goes away, because that's not really the point of it. Like,
right. Yeah.
That's like what people might try to chase later on.
No, I'm not chasing a high for sure. Like I'm not. Yeah.
But no, otherwise, like, I don't know, do you feel more focused? Do you feel like it's easier to pay attention to things or reading and stuff like that?
Definitely. Yeah. Like I've noticed even with my speech, when I would get really animated, if I was talking about something on the stream and my adrenaline would get going, I would trip over my words quite a bit, like full on stutter, like a Biden stutter. And I've noticed in the last 2 days, that's just basically gone altogether. I'm able to like follow conversations a lot easier in our exchange, much easier for me to like follow the track of the conversation. Whereas before my mind would be very like, there's just a lot of chatter normally. Yeah, definitely like this feels like a very different kind of like experience. Why did you get, how was ADHD like disrupting your life before? How did that manifest?
Because I was only ever good at focusing on the things that I was instinctively, uncontrollably interested in at the time. So I would be able to sit there and read like 100 pages of some boring shit for like, I would be able to do that, but it was only like, it wasn't selective. It was just the moment would hit me and I would just do it. And I would kind of forget the rest of the world exists. So as far as executive function goes and just keeping like a day-to-day routine and doing things when I have to do them, that's been always very, very difficult for me, especially if it's something I don't want to do. Whereas with meds, it's quite doable.
And how long have you been on
them? It's a good question. I think definitely not a year, more than 6 months. Yeah.
And you noticed like a pretty big difference then? Has it had like an enormous difference or a more subtle difference in your life?
It's quite subtle. I think it's also because I think to be properly focused, there needs to be a few changes, not just medication. So when my sleep pattern isn't good, I will take meds and still just doom scroll and whatever the else, right? Or if my sleep pattern changes, or if I haven't been out for a walk first thing in the morning, I haven't had like fresh air or sunlight, or if I haven't eaten at a good time, then a lot of the benefits will just kind of not really be there.
Yeah.
Or if I'm in high stress environments for too long, then it won't really be there. But no, yeah, it's definitely like, there was a moment, I can't even remember what I was doing. I wasn't streaming. I think I was reading something and taking notes. And then I just stopped for a minute to think about just how much easier it was and how much I was actually just in the moment enjoying it rather than drifting and worrying about other things and getting distracted. And then I actually just cried. Like I was like, yeah. I didn't realize that it took this long to feel like a normal functional person because I'm like 33, you know, and I'd been to psychologists all since I was like a teenager because I'm autistic and shit, but ADHD just never came up. And then when I eventually got that realization that like my life was actually becoming quite different and I was able to much more closely commit to the things I wanted to, it just made me feel like so much better about everything. So that was a nice realization.
Yeah, I didn't
magic, but it's like, it's the closest drug I've had to it. Yeah.
Yeah. I looked up, one of the first things I did, if I'm prescribed any drug really, one of the first things I do is I kind of go on YouTube and I just look up like my experience with that drug or whatever. And what you described is, I think, pretty common. I have not experienced that kind of cathartic release of just having a moment where it's like, oh, this is how I could have been living the whole time. But I read and I learned about a lot of other people having, it seems like pretty common experience that people have with ADHD where they take a medication, they get emotional about the like benefits that they immediately experience. I don't have that problem with sleep as much because I have a bipolar diagnosis too. I did have like an emotional cathartic release when I got medication for that, because like bipolar is actually a lot easier to treat than like unipolar depression or any other kind of depression, really. The effectiveness of those meds are like pretty high. And I took, once I started taking the current med, I didn't get a diagnosis for bipolar until I was 39 years old. So I had been living like a very, we'll say, chaotic life for like all my adult life, just a lot of ups and downs and just crazy instability. And then once I started taking that medication for bipolar, I did get emotional there, because it was like, oh my God, I can have like a normal life. But that medication like makes me very tired. So even if the ADHD meds kind of potentially interrupt sleep, if I take this medication for the other thing, then I'm tired, dead tired, like 30 minutes later. So.
Cocktails.
Well, cool, man. Yeah, I enjoyed this conversation with you. Are you doing anything fun for the weekend?
Yeah. Oh, I won't be streaming, so yeah, I've got a few things to do with like friends and stuff. Yeah, I'm all good.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, enjoy your weekend. It was good talking with you.
Yeah. You got much going on next couple of days?
I spend the weekends with my fiance, so she kind of like, I'm more of a homebody and she's very active, and so it's just kind of whatever she wants to do usually. So I think tomorrow we're gonna go to the Ren Fair, which is always pretty fun.
What's the Ren Fair?
You guys don't have Renaissance Fair in Scotland?
Oh, Renaissance Fair.
Yeah.
I'm sure we do. I've never been to it. Yeah.
You should go. It's a ton of fun. Good food.
Do you dress up? Do you dress up like a knight?
I don't. No, I feel too silly I'm too prideful to do that. But like 75% of people that go to Ren Fair dress up, I'd say.
You think is being a streamer not like less cool than going and dressing up at a Ren Fair?
I mean, it's probably less cool. There was a time where it was like cool to say that you were a YouTuber or a content creator. And I feel like that ship has sailed, because for the last 5 years, I kind of avoid the question when people ask me what I do for a living. I'll kind of phrase it in a different way without saying I'm a streamer. But I feel like too many people have poisoned the well for us.
Yeah, well, that sounds fun. I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, man. Yeah, have a good weekend. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, take care, buddy. Bye-bye.
We got to keep that bridge solid. He's one of the good ones, man. He's one of the good ones. He's got a good like combination of things. First of all, that sultry voice. I mean, my God, just an incredible voice. Second of all, very logical person, very rational person, which seems like a rarity these days. And third of all, he is crazy well informed about the topics that he covers. Like, you can tell that he reads books and takes notes and makes an effort to be super informed. And so these are qualities I think are really lacking these days, unfortunately, in political coverage. There's just way too much shallow, superficial analysis. It drives me insane.